how this group came about. We had a session last year with the wonderful, I can't see him, but is Chico on the call yet? No, can't see him yet. But we had a fantastic session last year with Chico Chakrabarty of Doing Diversity Different. And he gave us quite a thorough understanding of the issues of diversity, inclusion, and also a sense of belonging. And at the end of the group, it was a consensus that could we do something regionally to talk about this matter and this subject and share everybody's experiences, but also to discuss the nuances that regional difference can make in terms of the D&I and agenda. So that's why this group was set up. So welcome, and absolutely delighted that Patrick has decided to take the spotlight for the first sessions. No pressure, Patrick. So Patrick's worked for public sector for well over 20 years in senior positions, and he currently is diversity, equality and inclusion lead for both Northumberland County Council but also Northumbria NHS Trust. So not a small job there, quite a big job to do, and he does have a team. So not only today is he going to share the initiatives that they've introduced across the two local authority businesses, but also his own personal journey. So a bit of transparency as an out gay man. He's going to talk about his employment journey and the challenges that he's faced that has helped to shape, I guess, the job that he's in now, and a lot of the networks that he's set up. So I'm going to hand over to Patrick now. Please feel free to use the chat box. Put any questions that you've got, because there's so many of us on the call today that we might not have time to get through all of everybody's questions, but please use the chat box and put any questions in, put your hands up, and we will share the slides afterwards. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Patrick, and we'll probably chip in it again later. So over to you, Patrick.
Thanks very much. Thanks. So when somebody mentioned Boris Johnson there, it's just like, it's nothing to do with kind of political leanings or anything else. I hasten to add. So next, it was about the next slide bit. So the next slide, please. Thanks. I'll tell you a little bit about myself as we go through the presentation, but hopefully this will give you a little bit of a background. Really, what I wanted to do is something that we trialled in both the Trust and the Council recently that I think has been really beneficial and has kind of had a really good response.
Can you all see those slides now? Have they come through? Sorry there, Patrick.
I've got something here that says our candidate journey.
That's your computer, we can see.
That's your computer now. We could see the slide initially.
I told you I would get it wrong.
Julie, it was just a PDF that we could see. I don't know if there's actual slides.
Yeah, bear with us. Sorry, I'll just keep working in the background here.
Okay, right. So I'll just I'll introduce myself. So obviously, you know my name. You know a little bit about my background in terms of work. I've worked for probably 27 years now for the NHS. I'm employed by the NHS, but half of my salary is paid from last year. It's been paid by Northumberland County Council as well. So I've got a job that is about kind of equality, diversity and inclusion across both of those organisations. So I work, I'm based within the HR teams in both organisations, but actually the job is much more about building a culture and a kind of a process for inclusion across both of those organisations. What I wanted to do, hopefully when we can get the slides up, we'll be able to do that.
Apologies, I'm technically backwards here today.
Is to talk to you a little bit about what equality, diversity and inclusion means to me. A few kind of definitions that I've come across that I found very helpful and very useful. And also to tell you a little bit about kind of authenticity and why I think it's really important to be able to be yourself and how that makes a difference in, oh, that's great, that's come up now, why that makes a difference in the work that you can manage to do around equality, diversity and inclusion. So next slide, please.
Now you're testing us.
I'm really testing you now. There you go. Okay, so this definition, which I think has been, it's been doing the rounds for a long time, hasn't it? Or at least the first two parts have. Certainly diversity and inclusion, this is a Werner Myers kind of quote of the first two. Diversity is inviting a lot of different kinds of people to your party. So, you don't just have the same old, same old. Inclusion will be maybe greeting them at the door, kind of telling them that they're all welcome, and then maybe asking them all to dance. So everybody's got an opportunity to show. But I think what's really important in the world of diversity and inclusion is this last point here, which is about belonging. And belonging is about asking people to be involved in planning the party, getting them to be involved in the selection of the music, the creation of the menu, and the entertainment. So I'm hoping you can see that there's a difference there, and I think that's where organisations are moving towards, that whole sense of making their staff feel like they belong and making communities that we serve feel like they've got a place in our organisations and they actually can shape the agenda. So I think the difference has been over the past few years that we started to move away from just acknowledging the fact that there are different kinds of people who might have slightly different needs, in providing them a place at the table, if you like, and listening to their voices when their voices are raised. Okay, so if you move on to the next slide. There's a few quotes here that I like to use, and I looked up kind of thinking about businesses and thinking about work. And the first one's by Henry Ford, might not be an obvious one, but coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, but working together is what leads to success. Now, whatever we think of Henry Ford and his processes, I know Tamla Motown picked up that kind of process when they set their business up as well. Berry Gordy used that as one of his templates for building success, and certainly that kind of worked very well. One of the things that I think we try and do is that we try to work with our staff and with the people from some of the protected characteristic groups that work within our organisation, because we recognise that if we work with them, they can provide a much richer kind of stew of ideas, if you like, and kind of solutions to things. The second one's from somebody probably most people have heard about, is Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat at the front of a bus in segregated South in America at a time when Black people were only allowed to sit at the back of the bus. And she says, people say I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. The only tired I was tired of giving in. And I think what that says to me, and what it says to a lot of people is that actually this is not just a one-off battle. You don't just win something and then everything is okay and it's absolutely fine. And I think we've seen pretty good evidence of that in the USA and in the UK following the Black Lives Movement. It's not something that you just do on a one-off basis and you get it right and that's it. I think there's something about you've got to be consistent in your approach and in your messages and in your efforts to kind of tackle inequalities. And then this really famous medic, Dr. Seuss. I know if people have heard of that person, not really a medic, in case people are confused, he's a children's author. Why fit in when you were born to stand out? I think a lot of our businesses and a lot of our delivery in the past was predicated on everybody's got to fit a particular template, you've got to fit, your face has got to fit, our recruitment processes, etc., etc. We tend to recruit people in our own image, and that's a kind of whole thing about unconscious bias, isn't it? However, why fit in when you're born to stand out? For me, says it's okay to be you. As an individual, we need to value your contribution as a unique contribution, and that kind of uniqueness brings a challenge, and it also brings some richness to what it is that we're going to do. And this last one was from an American, I think he's a baseball or a volleyball player. He's kind of quite a popular sportsman in the USA, who said, openness may not completely disarm prejudice, but it's a good place to start. And that's one of the principles that kind of I try and live my life by, is that there are no embarrassing questions, there are no difficulties for people asking me anything. I try and be as open as I possibly can be about my experience. And in that way, that allows people to ask the questions they really want to ask, but they might be a little bit embarrassed about asking. And I think you can apply that to race, you can apply that to gender, you can apply that to trans issues, you can apply that LGBT or Black and minority ethnic issues as well. Okay, so next slide, please. Right, so this is about me, of course. So hopefully you'll learn something about process and about kind of what it is I do and how I got to where I got to. And I say, I don't know if anybody's watched It's a Sin. There's a new Russell T Davies series that's kind of streaming at the minute, which is about the experience of gay and bisexual men and their friends and their families from the early 80s onwards, which is, of course, when HIV/AIDS kind of first came to light. And that's the time at which I was kind of, I suppose, establishing my identity as a gay man and kind of understanding some of the prejudices and some of the kind of restrictions that were placed on who you could be as a gay and bisexual man. So we've gone from that to another favorite program of mine is Schitt's Creek, and I don't know if anybody has watched this. It's been developed by a father and son, Eugene Levy. People might know him from lots of other kind of films in the US, and his son Dan, who's an out gay man, and they've written I suppose a kind of not a sitcom exactly, but a comical series, which is based in an invented town called Schitt's Creek, which rich people, apparently in the US, there was a history of people who were kind of invested the money by buying up small towns that were really kind of not going anywhere and not doing particularly well, and they lose all of their money and they end up in this place called Schitt's Creek. And it's a story about how they manage that and their relationship with their local people, and it's much about their relationship as a family. Now, the reason that I think we've gone from It's a Sin to Schitt's Creek is because there's been a massive amount of progress in the legislation and in the culture around acceptance of gay, bisexual and trans people. We're not there yet, I don't think, but I think it gives you a bit of a sense of kind of some of my kind of journey has been from a time when being gay and being out, and particularly in the Northeast, was maybe not seen as something that was very positive, through to a kind of a series of programs and kind of a concept where being gay is just incidental to the story. You know, there are gay relationships and here straight relationships and any combination of relationships. And actually, that's not the focus of the story. It's really about kind of relationships and how you build them and how you maintain them. So I haven't got any more slides. And what I wanted to do was to really just talk to you now a little bit about my experience. And if anything resonates with you, and if you've got any questions you want to ask, I'm more than happy to answer them at the end of this. So a little bit about my background. I was born and raised in the Northeast. So I was born in Middlesbrough in the early 60s. So I kind of came of age and started to develop my own sense of self and who I was in my teenage years in a kind of working class Irish Catholic kind of family with lots of brothers and sisters, lots of cousins, and a kind of extended kind of family that we had. Working in a largely white community, you know, there were very, very few Black and minority ethnic people living in our estate. My family moved over with lots of other people who lived on the estate from Ireland into the Northeast to work on places like the docks and the steel works and kind of in the building works, because Middlesbrough was a kind of very developing industrial town, as most of you will know. I grew up as a heterosexual man. Now, that might surprise some people, because I knew I was gay. I knew I was different. I don't think I could put a label on it at the time, but actually everybody grows up as a heterosexual by and large, and that might feel like a fairly controversial statement, but I would kind of hazard a guess that most people assume that their children are going to do more or less the same thing that they've done. Nobody assumes that their child's going to be gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. Maybe that might have changed a little bit now, but certainly in the 60s and the 70s, that was very much not on the table. There was no talk about gay people. There were no kind of role models around at that time. There certainly weren't people in my family that I knew who were gay or bisexual or transgender. That's not the case now, interestingly, but certainly I knew that there was a lot of pressure on people to conform to a particular kind of masculinity. I had kind of it was quite a rough estate that I was brought up on. You know, it was a very kind of like, you know, if you stepped out of your estate, you were always a victim of potential violence from people from the other estates, because they just somehow had a terrible knack of understanding that you weren't born in that street or that kind of locality. So, it was kind of like you grew up with a sense of having to protect yourself and look after yourself, and that there was a certain way to be, and it was about fighting, it was about kind of drinking, it was about kind of that kind of hard man, northern working class culture. Now, of course, the first thing that I did when I had an opportunity was kind of get out of there, to be honest with you. And I was too cowardly to go to London, and I knew one person who lived in Birmingham, so I moved to the West Midlands. I went to university, first person in my family to do that. There was no kind of previous example of anybody who'd ever gone into further education at all in my family. I started a little bit of a flood there because the rest of my family kind of followed suit eventually. But I guess one of the reasons that I left was you just have an understanding, I think, that somehow to be yourself, you can't do that within the context that you've been brought up in sometimes. There are too many pressures for you to be a particular way. And in fact, what I did is I got engaged to a young woman I was at school with, who was she was just my best friend, really, is what that was about, rather than any kind of sexual attraction. But then that kind of put people off the story, if you like. When I went to university, of course, it was a real opportunity to kind of come out and start to think about, well, who do I really want to be, as Patrick. I got involved in the music scene. I got involved in local Catholic clubs as well. Interestingly, I met more gay men there than I'd ever met before in my life, and they were quite out about it, which surprised me immensely, because that was not my experience in my own church back in Middlesbrough. And I started to kind of understand that there are different ways of being, and that kind of some people actually had fairly positive relationships with their family. They could be out of their family. So that's what I did. At the age of 19, 20, I came out to my family. I came out to my then fiance as well, which was quite a difficult conversation to have, as you can understand. And I think that's another thing that I suppose that characterizes being different, is somehow, because you're in opposition to what the expected norm is, you're quite often having to explain yourself to people and say, this is who I really am, because when people look at you, they don't automatically assume that you might be different to them. So you make a choice, I suppose, as a gay bisexual man, to tell people or not tell people who you really are. And you'd make that choice based on your assumption about what the response might be to that information that you give them. And in my experience, that by and large has been very positive. I've been exceptionally lucky, but I have had friends who've been rejected by their family. I've had friends who've been attacked on the street. I've had friends who've had very, very difficult relationships with their colleagues at work, who've maybe been sacked or let go because of their sexual orientation. And this was kind of in the 80s. And at the time, just to put some context around that, we had a thing called Section 28, which the Thatcher government introduced, which is about not being able to talk about the normality of gay and bisexual and lesbian relationships in school. There were very much a promotion of normality. And the reason I referenced It's a Sin is because, of course, HIV/AIDS became a huge kind of issue in the UK in the early to mid 80s. And of course, one of the things that came out in the initial kind of conversations about HIV and AIDS is how much it affected gay and bisexual men. And in some ways, there was a lot of victim blaming. There wasn't a lot of infrastructure and support or understanding about how to treat the illness. There wasn't a lot of it was a little bit like COVID is now in some ways. There was a lot of myths around it, and there was a lot of research going on very quickly for kind of medical and clinical staff to get up to speed. And as a result of that, I think what I recognized is a lot of my friends have been treated pretty badly by clinical and medical staff and by social care staff. I really I didn't think that was right. There was something about the way that I was raised. And I've got to say, kind of my mother was an exception in her kind of, for a woman from her background, for a working class Irish Catholic woman who had a very strong faith. She recognized that everybody had value. And I think one of the things that she really drummed into us as children is, you are no better than anybody else, but you are no worse than anybody else. And I will expect you to treat other people in a way that is welcoming and open and kind of doesn't make assumptions about them, because when we came to this country, we had that same kind of prejudice applied to us as we see applied to other people, you know, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs when they came over here. So, you know, I kind of came from that kind of, I suppose, a value base that things should be fair. So when I saw that things weren't fair for my gay and bisexual friends, and particularly in relation to medical and healthcare, I really wanted to make a bit of a difference to that. So anyway, when I finished university, I stayed working in Birmingham for about 3 years. I worked with deaf and hard of hearing people. I was a sign language interpreter. I trained to do that. And I kind of, again, realized that there was a lot of misinformation and a lot of lack of information going out to people who didn't either have English as a first language, or who weren't aware of some of the cultural references that were being talked about in the HIV/AIDS field. So I started a small kind of group of friends and myself got together and started to talk about how we might support clinical staff to deal much more effectively with gay and bisexual men. And I moved back to the Northeast, and I helped set up an organization called AIDS North, which was a kind of an education group who was comprised of people whose either family members had had HIV, who had partners who had HIV, or who were HIV positive themselves. Our aim was to try and kind of address some of those myths that were kind of prevalent, and to get some real education in place for clinical and medical staff. And we worked alongside people who had clinical expertise to try and develop a kind of much more empathetic and sympathetic response to people who were HIV positive, and to provide some support for family members, partners of people who were HIV positive and had AIDS. So my work history in the Northeast very much started out from a kind of like a political desire to make a change, if you like. And that's kind of characterized my progression through my workplace to date, actually. So again, I carried on doing the sign language interpreting as well. I worked on the first kind of Channel 4 film program that introduced kind of film and the concept of editing and kind of script writing and kind of making programs to deaf and hard of hearing people, as well as to disabled people and people who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and people who were women. Because what Channel 4 recognizes, there was not equality within, you know, the whole of the kind of media setup, and they wanted to have people who could edit, could script write, could do, you know, could use their skills. And if anybody's tried to explain sound to a person who's never heard sound, I can tell you it's a real challenge. We invented a language, actually, which I think I was quite excited about, kind of being at that forefront of things. So you can see that kind of like the way that I've got involved things and the way that my career has evolved has been about having these opportunities to be at the forefront of things and start to develop responses to, I suppose, areas of inequality that we've identified. So one of the first things that I did get involved in when I worked for a local authority in the first instance was with the MESMAC project. And I don't know if people have heard about MESMAC Northeast. MESMAC was the very first national gay and bisexual men's HIV prevention project. Okay, and there were 4 sites. We were funded by the Department of Health, and Newcastle City Council was the only statutory sector organisation that was prepared to participate in this national programme, which was about providing 2 things. One was support for groups of gay and bisexual men, and the other bit was about providing education and support to all of the other kind of services that needed to be provided to gay and bisexual men. So, you know, some of the social care services, some of the medical services, and definitely working very closely with sexual health. We did a lot of outreach on the gay scene, and we did a lot of work out in public cruising areas as well. So we engaged directly with people who were affected and impacted by HIV and AIDS. And what we picked up was that continuing, I suppose, kind of threat that a lot of people lived under at that time, of fear of kind of, you know, can I go abroad and kind of get travel insurance if I've got HIV? You know, what are the kind of regulations to kind of work safely at work? You know, kind of how can I kind of take time out of work for treatment without kind of disclosing to my employer that I'm HIV positive, because they're the kind of things that people really did worry about, and legitimately so, because, you know, quite often people did get a very raw deal in relation to their not just sexual orientation, but certainly to HIV/AIDS as well. What struck me about that work, to be honest, was the amount of people who weren't directly affected or impacted by that, who really stepped up and became allies of the gay community at that time. A lot of lesbians that I worked with, a lot of heterosexual family members, and people who, just because they recognized that this was an issue they needed to address, they stepped up and they really started to, I suppose, show their true colours and kind of really support their colleagues and their friends and their family members who were gay and bisexual men. And what that kind of said to me was, what it made me recognise essentially was how important it is to have allies. And I think, you know, when I talk to my friends who are Black, when I speak to friends who are disabled, they say the one thing that really tires them out, which is a little bit like the Rosa Parks kind of issue, is consistently having to fight prejudice and having to be the person in the room who's got to make the response to any off-colour remark or any kind of, you know, if somebody raises an issue that might be a little bit off-colour, everybody looks to that person to see, is that okay? How do you feel about that? And I think what I recognised was it was a massive benefit for some gay men to be able to put that burden down for a little while and just be people themselves and let somebody else pick that up on their behalf. So if you hear one thing from this conversation, it is the importance of being an ally to people who are maybe different from you and might be experiencing some of that prejudice that they have. Anyway, eventually that kind of experience led me to being asked to establish a sexual health service in Northumberland. Because believe it or not, that time in 1990, it was that I started working, 1994, sorry. There was no sexual health service beyond a contraception service in Northumberland. So there's no HIV, GUM, no kind of broader sexual health service in there at all. So that work was, I suppose, happening in a place where you would think, actually, you know, it's rural Northumberland, it's 98.3% white population. People assume that kind of there are no gay bisexual men there, and, you know, that there might be a few lesbians who've moved to the countryside, you know, because that's a kind of popular, I suppose, myth about kind of lesbians move away from the city and kind of go out in rural areas, and the gay men move into the city because that's where the main scene is, and the scene is very much targeted at gay and bisexual men, or it wasn't particularly at that time. So again, one thing that I recognized is not to make assumptions about who people were and the receptiveness to doing something that was slightly different, and recognizing that people need to have attention given to them because they are being discriminated against for whatever reason. I never met, I don't think I met more than one or two people who were resistant to looking at broadening the scope of the services that we had available there. You know, that didn't say, actually, yeah, there will be gay and bisexual men who want to use our services. There will be women who want to talk about something other than contraception. There will be lesbians who've got concerns about sexual health who might want an opportunity to come and, you know, have some kind of medical intervention or talk to somebody. And we need to make this service welcome to all of them. So my, I suppose my assumption when I first went there is I'm going to have a little bit of a battle on my hand in this area, because it's very rural. There's not much, there's no gay scene there at all. People won't understand kind of what the needs and desires are of gay and bisexual men. And what I found was a very open and receptive culture within the trust that I worked in. To the extent that, I suppose, as I worked my way through the ranks and I became a senior manager and I managed all the community health services in Northumberland and North Tyneside, that people were quite frequently coming to me and saying, we want to make our service more responsive. We've got a talk and therapy service. How do we make sure that what we're doing is meeting the needs of our Black population, which is fairly limited, but, you know, that means that quite often they're placed under a lot more kind of stress because they don't necessarily have access to kind of other people who are similar to them necessarily. They don't have the same cultural outlets as you might have in a larger city where there's a bigger population. So there was a recognition that because there may be fewer people, you might need to make more effort to engage with those people as well. So again, that's the other thing that I think I would say about being in the Northeast, is I think we make assumptions that kind of the culture is not receptive to difference. You know, we've got a reputation, haven't we? I know I'm on a lot of national bodies, and when I go and talk to them about what it is we've been able to achieve here, people are kind of slightly surprised that we're ahead of the pack in a whole lot of ways that we do things. And I think that is partly because there is a recognition that actually, if there are very few people, you almost need to make more effort to be in contact, and you really need to think about how your messages are sent out and how they're received and how people respond to them as well. And certainly we've seen that writ large, I think, around COVID, where we've had to be much more responsive to Black and ethnic minority staff and communities around engaging them with, some of the messages, the key messages that we need to get out there, and do recognise that there's a disproportionate effect on that community compared to the routine, the regular kind of community, if you like, the white community. And I think that was only highlighted by Black Lives Matters, wasn't it? And the response to that by a number of people saying, well, all lives matter. But I don't think anybody ever said that all lives don't matter, but what they were saying is we need to recognise that some lives are more at risk than others in this situation. And I think that dialogue, that has really created, I suppose, a great deal of thinking in people about, well, how do we respond to issues like that? Is that legitimate? How do we kind of make sure that we hear what those real messages are from those communities, rather than just assuming that one size fits all? We need to be a little bit more nuanced in how we provide our services. So the other thing that I did when I worked in both organisations is I made some connections with Stonewall, which is the national LGBT, it's recognised LGBT kind of champions, if you like. Now, they advise the government on a whole range of things. They're kind of involved in the NHS employers partnership. They certainly have kind of quite an influential voice. Whatever people may think of Stonewall as an organisation, I think they very much did put LGBT rights on the agenda. And what they did that really helped me, I've got to say, kind of embed some of the work that we've done, not just for LGBT people, but for all of our kind of protected characteristic groups, is that they provided one of the first national frameworks for how you might measure how you are performing as an organisation against a set of metrics around your policies, your practice, your employment, and your service delivery as well. And both the council and the trust signed up to be part of the Stonewall Workplace Equality Index. Now, it's a bit of a bun fight sometimes. It's a bit of a, how do you write your policies to make, to kind of make the most impact on the index, as you kind of end up shifting a little bit towards kind of, shaping your organizational response to need based on what the index says, rather than listening directly to your staff. I think sometimes we've all been a bit guilty of that in the competition to be, in the top 10 Stonewall employers list. But actually what it did do is it made us look inwards and made us look outwards about kind of how we deliver services to particularly LGBT communities. And what that does, I think, in some ways, is it gives you a kind of a clear rationale for kind of why you should be doing what you're doing. And as a read across from the work that we did with LGBT people to how we deliver our services to some other groups as well that might be vulnerable, to disabled service users, to people from a Black and minority ethnic background as well, because some of the frameworks that are brought in from Stonewall, we need to look at how we treat everybody, not just LGBT members of staff as well. One of the things that I think has been a characteristic of mine is that I'm very open about who I am. Do you know what I mean? What you see is kind of what you get. And I applied that thinking to people who are chief executives, as well as I do to people who are working as porters or kitchen staff in the whole place. And it's kind of that thing that I was talking about that my mum drummed into you: know better than anybody else, but you're as good as everybody else as well. And what I've found is being open and authentic about who you are, and just kind of introducing things about, you know, your partner when I had one, or the fact that I'm a dad and I've got 2 kids, and I got them in a fairly I kind of had those kids in a fairly unconventional way, in a relationship with a lesbian couple, and you know that I'm still actively part of their lives, and kind of I'm their dad, even though they didn't live with me, they lived with their moms. Those kind of things, if I introduce them in a way that is just like, you know, it's just part of the background of who I am, and you know, I expect that you'll be able to respond to that effectively, has really opened people's eyes about the differences in people's experiences, and it's enabled people to ask some of the questions that they felt a little bit uneasy about, or they didn't know about, or they were embarrassed about. And it's been able to say, for me, what it did for me, I guess, is to say, you know, I'm a person who has relationships with a family. I've got a great family. My best friends are my brothers and sisters. I've been, you know, I was a carer for my dad who had dementia, and I cared for my mom who had cancer as well. So I'm more than just being gay, you know, and I think what people see is they see, you know, if people have got a particular religious background, that they filter their views of them through that. They filter their views of who people are through their sexual orientation, if they're open about it. They maybe filter their views about who people are based on what a disability they may or may not have. So I think the one thing that I've been able to do is, maybe because I've been myself and I've been authentic at work, is to challenge some of those assumptions people might make. I'm interested in sport. You know, I was for a long time the chair of the Northumberland Sports Partnership. I'm now kind of part of the RISE Partnership kind of board as well, which is the regional sports partnership. You know, I kind of, you know, I do all sorts of things that are nothing to do with what people might think of as traditionally a kind of gay culture, I suppose. You know, I'm not a big fan of disco necessarily, you know, although I do like a bit of a dance. And I did perform for many years in a band that was an LGBT band. But it is about kind of like, the important thing for me were the strength of the relationships that I was able to form with my colleagues and with my partners, and showing as much interest in their lives as they showed in mine. Because I think the thing that you lose sometimes is that sense of curiosity about who other people are that you're working alongside, or that you're providing a kind of a service to. And I think if you lose that, you become a little bit more kind of narrow in your focus, don't you, on kind of what it is that you do at work. So again, another thing that I would say is, if you can, you know, ask people questions. You know, don't be afraid to ask questions. When I talk to friends who are trans, the thing that they say quite often is they get isolated because people are afraid to ask them questions. And quite often that is not because they're not curious or they don't really want to know something about them, but they don't get to know them as a person because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. You know, they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And that is the case in so many kind of issues, isn't it? And what my friend says, you can get it wrong. You can get it wrong. It's okay to get it wrong. And I often give this advice to people who are coming out, and you know, they're a bit disappointed when people don't react in the way that they expect. Is I say that, you know, well, look, you've had all of these years to get used to being you and to kind of come to an understanding of what that means. But you may be giving somebody some information they've never heard before or they hadn't considered, and they won't have an instant reaction that's positive necessarily. You maybe need to give them time and kind of share your life with them a little bit more, and give them an opportunity to see that this is not something that's a negative thing, but could be a real asset, if you like. So my parents were very, very unusual, I suppose, in the fact that although they had some difficulties initially when I came out, I kept them engaged in my life. I introduced them to my friends. I introduced them to my partners. I invited them to the gigs that I did, which were largely kind of people lesbian, gay, bisexual and their friends. You know, the live theatre in Newcastle, at the universities, at the Pride events and etc. And they got to see that, you know, my life was just like a routine life, really, that had lots of friends, that had people who didn't make an issue of the fact that I was gay, bisexual, who might be heterosexual themselves. And in fact, my mom and was an absolute demon at kind of trying to identify whether any of my friends were lesbian or gay. And she'd often tell them, she'd know, I think you might be gay. You know, you're just not out yet. You need to tell your mum, or I'll help you if you like. So one of the other things that we did in Mesmac, I know this is a bit rambly, is that we helped to set up the Parents Inquiry Northeast, because we recognised that a lot of the support people needed was from their family. They wanted to have that relationship with the family, but the families quite often felt like they needed some additional help and additional support. My job now, last year, well, no, 2 years ago, I decided that I didn't want to be a general manager. I did all the equality work on top of my day job, if you like. And I had an opportunity to go for one of the deputy director posts at the trust, and I had to think about that. And I thought, actually, no, I really do want to have a good work-life balance. I decided not to go for that, but I decided to have a conversation with both chief execs and say, if you really want to take equality and diversity seriously, and we've been doing pretty well so far, you know, there's been a lot of investment in terms of people's signing up for equality and diversity. But I said, if you want to do this properly, you really need to think about investing in it. And I'd be happy to be the person who heads up that piece of work, but I want to do that as my main job rather than doing it as an add-on to my job as a general manager. And I wasn't expecting an immediate yes, but that's exactly what they did. They said, absolutely, we need to do this and we need to invest more in it. So, you know, kind of since, I suppose, a year and a half ago, I started as a full-time equality, diversity and inclusion lead, half-time for the council, half-time for the trust, as I said. And that has really led to a massive increase in the amount of work we've been able to do. We've had several really positive campaigns. We've got 7 staff network groups that were established. So we give staff facility time to run those, to come to those networks, and we give the chairs kind of a clear remit and support to do that. We give them administrative support as well, so that they don't have to think about, you know, taking notes and action points. The point of those network groups was really twofold. One was about just saying, some staff may not feel as if they've got an equal say in things, or may not feel like they get a fair deal. And we want to support people to kind of feel like they do have a sense of belonging to the organisation. And similarly, the other aim was around kind of engaging those staff to say, how can we be better as organisations? How can we meet the needs of people like you? How can you help us with some of our processes to improve that? So, you know, the network chairs get involved in things like shaping our recruitment process. They get involved in things like heading up campaigns, engaging with other staff around recruitment events that we are leading on, getting involved in some of the communications that the trust and the council put out, you know, kind of maybe writing blogs and doing vlogs as well around campaigns. So we're raising a kind of cultural awareness and kind of identifying staff and saying, you know, we really value your input to our culture. Because for me, that's where we're at now, is we're at a point where we've acknowledged that the culture isn't necessarily always the most welcoming to everybody, and we really do want to make that work a lot better. So those network groups have been instrumental, I think, in developing some of that culture. So, you know, some of our staff network groups have done sessions like this for our leadership team or for our boards, and for, you know, just our general staff as well. And that, I think, has started a program of kind of cultural education, if you like. So not a kind of, you know, a kind of a dry, this is the policy and this is the practice and this is, you know, how it is for people, but more about a conversation, I think. And we've titled those sessions, Everything You Wanted to Ask, but We're Afraid to. So our next session's around trans issues. We've done one around Black and minority ethnic staff. We've done one around LGBT staff, and we've done one for disabled staff as well. So we'll do those on a kind of a rolling basis. The next one I think we're going to do after the trans one is about women and leadership, because of course it's International Women's Day in March, and we've got a vast amount of women working for us. 80% of our staff are women in the trust, and I think 50% more or less in the council. And we've got some great leaders, and I think we just need to celebrate that and kind of promote that. So the other thing that I would say is, it doesn't need to be a dry kind of topic area, equality, diversity, inclusion. It should never be the last thing on your list of things to do, and oh, we need to think about equality. My job, I think, and I think our job as well, is to kind of get equality, diversity at the front end of any process. So to be thinking, when we're doing this, how is it going to impact on these groups? Is there anything I can do to mitigate any kind of negative impacts? How can I really engage with those people that I think haven't participated in this in the past? Look at your staff surveys, look at the kind of things that people are saying about kind of their experience with you, and then respond to that in a really proactive and positive way, but do it with them. That thing about belonging that I was talking about at the beginning, that has made the biggest difference, I think, in our organisations, is that staff now feel like they've got a voice, but their voice is being heard because we've made some changes as a result of what it is that they've said. So I can't tell you exactly what time it is. I feel like I've talked for quite a long time. If anybody's got any questions or anybody wants to ask me about anything specific, I suppose now is your opportunity to do so. I don't know how we're going to do this, but
Patrick, that was absolutely fantastic. The open and the transparency there was just, I was enthralled all the way through. I guess, can we use the reaction button if anybody wants to raise their hand to ask a question? I see we've got Chico. Chico's got his hand raised. Do you want to should we unmute you, Chico, if you want to?
Oh, no, it was just an applause. Thank you very much, Patrick, for your openness and your vulnerability. So thank you.
You're welcome. Okay.
Has anybody got anything they'd like to ask Patrick?
I've got somebody with a hand up on my screen, DRN. And Julie Scanlon as well.
Yeah. Do you want to take yourself off mute?
Hi, yes, DRN's me. Sorry, it's Dawn. Thank you, Patrick. That was an excellent session. I'm intrigued to know where you think we might begin in an industry that denies they even have any challenges at all, because no one kind of comes forward to say what they represent, who they are, and it's on the surface almost with where people are at with what they stand for, and I mean any type, or whether it's gay or black or disabled, everything, because of the type of industry and the way it's driven. Where do you even start?
Well, I always think a really good place to start is kind of trying to understand who your staff group are. So, kind of one of the things that's really helped us is to drive up some of that kind of that personal information that people share with us as employee, and being really clear about why you want that information, because people do get a little bit suspicious. I mean, I'll give you an example. As some of our disabled staff network have been saying, we sometimes worry about kind of declaring our disability when we first come for a job, because we think people may discriminate against us. They don't know that that's the case, but that suspicion is always there, and it's sometimes based on previous experiences that they've had. But when we've said, the reason we want the information about kind of disability is so that we can make sure that the adjustments we make to it, because we really value your work, we want it to be really clear, we want the best out of the people that we employ, and why would we not do that? But we can't do that if we're putting processes in place that are discriminating against set groups. Once you've got that kind of information, I always think, I don't know if you do a staff survey or anything like that, you can provide some anonymous means for people to feedback, and not to just do it on a one-off basis. There's something about, it takes a while to build up that confidence in the organisation, and I think having somebody at the top of the organisation being prepared to role model that would be really, really good. So Daljit Lally, who's the Chief Executive in the Council, and Sir Jim Mackey, who's the Chief Executive in the Trust, both quite readily send out information about this is why this is important. It's leading from the top, if you like. But I guess the bits, I suppose this is quite a common experience with everyone, is sometimes it's the middle management layer that is in resistance sometimes to change, because they haven't implemented, they don't necessarily have the tools to do it. So it's about doing some of that kind of, doing it in a way that is supportive as well as challenging. So I think kind of, this is why we need to do it. Here's a way you can do it that makes it easier. If you've got any questions, don't be afraid to ask them, because no question is a stupid question. Sometimes people want to be better than they appear on the surface, don't they? And they're just not given the opportunity. Yeah. So it's about consistency of messages, clear messages from the top about why we want the information and what difference that will make. And, you know, success is based on, you know, how good the people are who work for you, and how you know, you want to maximize the opportunities for them and also maximize their input into the organization.
Thank you, Patrick.
Okay.
Thank you. Julie, take you off mute.
Julie's cat's got in on the act as well.
My cat, I know, decided to appear the minute that I draw attention to myself. I hope everyone's okay with him sitting. Thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing your story. It really sort of shows us that, you know, the personal journey is the kind of work and life, and the political journey are all intermingled. And I just really appreciate your sharing your story with us. I guess I work independently on diversity and inclusion nowadays, so I'm not attached to any organisation. And I wondered what your thoughts were. You touched on it a little bit, on the big sort of schemes like Stonewall's workplace equality schemes, and whether they, in your opinion, do they really sort of foster meaningful change on the ground?
I think it depends how you use them, to be honest, Julie. And I think this year I made a decision in collaboration with my kind of network group leads and the HR execs that we'd step out of Stonewall for a year. I think what it did in the first instance, it gave us a kind of like a framework and a focus that enabled us to apply that thinking to all of our staff groups as well, about kind of looking at fairness and kind of equity in the language you use and all the rest of it. So I think it's been useful from that perspective. I think what sometimes you end up doing is you end up trying to answer the index questions rather than thinking about what do staff really think and what do staff really need and really want. And it's not to be disrespectful about Stonewall or the work that they do, but it's almost becoming almost impossible to answer some of the questions. So for example, you know, they kind of ask you, you know, for the makeup of your board and the kind of, you know, some of your senior staff, and who have you got who's trans, who have you got who's asexual, who have you got who's bi. And actually that's what you end up looking and thinking, well, actually, some people don't want to declare that. Some people don't want to share that information. They don't want to be the poster person for that particular issue. They just want to get on and do their job. And if you work and live in a place like the Northeast, you're less likely to have some of that intersectionality kind of evidence in place readily, just because of the sheer lack of numbers of people who might share that particular characteristic. So I'd say I think they're really good in terms of identifying what your current position is and getting yourself a benchmark to kind of measure your progress. We've got the same thing, you know, we've got the workforce race equality standard in the NHS and the disability equality standard as well, which measures kind of across several metrics about how you perform compared to the generic kind of staff group. And they're very good in terms of identifying particular issues that are there in that year. But I'll give you an example of why I think they're not always the most useful, because they look on an annual basis at that data. And if you don't do a full staff survey, it's based on our staff survey, then you're getting 10% of your staff, and a kind of a small percentage of those staff will be disabled, small percentage will be disabled, be from a Black and minority ethnic background. And the following year might be a completely different group of staff because they're randomly selected. So one year you might have a really positive outcome, and the next year it looks like you're really terrible as an organization. Whereas actually, you know, the truth is probably somewhere nearer the middle, I would say. So they're good in terms of, I think, identifying a framework, but I think we shouldn't be led by them. I think we should be led by what our staff tell us and what our staff are telling us they need. Yeah.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, we've got Michael's got his hand up there now.
And Chico's waving as well.
I was going to say, I think Chico's actual hand went up first, so I'll let Chico go first. Then I'll go with my virtual hand second, if you want, Chico.
Perfect, thank you. The one thing I just wanted to add to that comment by Patrick, and I think it's really true, is actually, so when we are collecting data, is actually trying to understand what we want the data to tell us when we're collecting it, because that's really, really critical. Lots of organizations may well, do an annual survey where you might ask questions such as, gender identity and sexual orientation, etc., to get a makeup of it. So you can measure that year on year. But what you don't necessarily always see is actually how easy is it for a female to have promotional opportunities within the organization? What's the sentiment or staff satisfaction level for people from different ethnic minority backgrounds, etc.? So actually, we need to think really carefully about what we want the data that we're collecting to tell us. And just because we are seeing that diversity, it certainly doesn't necessarily go and automatically equal the fact that people feel that they're included or they feel like they belong. I've kind of done some work with a number of organizations similar to Stonewall, and whilst they were showing great strides in terms of diversity, there were some really problematic behaviors that I was seeing in terms of the culture of the leadership. Yeah. And how that was then being impacted. So I was asked to kind of work with an organization on ethnic minority strategy, and it was really interesting. It was a chief exec and the BAME network team, and basically the BAME network team were only allowed to talk when the chief exec told them to. So it was almost like they were performing animals or something that were just there to punctuate what the chief exec was saying. So whilst it may well be diverse, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're benefiting from that. So you need to be really clear in what data you're getting and making sure that you're creating and curating those cultures of belonging for everyone there.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. We've got quickly time for Michael. One last question.
Well, thanks for that. So really just a question around, I'm almost going to call them labels, Patrick. So where organisations go, we must sign up to Stonewall because that'll make us look like we're an organisation that includes, LGBT plus. We must sign up to Disability Confidence Award, all what I will call labels. In your experience, is that what some person that classifies them in that way? So would be classes, they see themselves as LGBT plus, or they're from the BAME community, or they're from the disability community. Do they truly look for organisations in that way? And therefore, is it something that people should invest in to go forward as well?
Well, it's interesting. We just introduced that as a question in our recruitment for people to say, what is it that kind of made you come in? Was it anything about who we are as an organisation and our culture that attracted you to work here? And we've done a couple of senior recruitment kind of processes lately where people have said, I had to look on the index to see if you were on the index, or I had to look at kind of what your position was in terms of the Workforce Race Equality Standard or the Disability Equality Standard. And I noticed that you've got these network groups, etc. The thing that they were probably, I think, most attracted by was less these kind of the national standards, because I think they would have expected NHS and kind of local authority to be participating in that kind of thing. They were more impressed by the fact that we had network groups that had kind of staff who had facility time and were entitled to attend, and that we listened to what they said. That we'd made some adjustments to our recruitment processes. So, for example, we've got an autism spectrum disorder staff group, and they'd said, actually, we're not very good at doing the value-based recruitment stuff that you do. It's very difficult for us to answer some of the questions. Could we have these things put in place for our recruitment processes? The same thing with trans staff who'd said, actually, it's quite difficult coming and dealing with somebody in admin who doesn't understand who you are, hasn't been part of the interview process, and trying to get your qualifications recognised, even if they were in a previous, like your dead name. So what we did is we introduced a lead HR person who would be the contact person who would take that trans person through the process, so they didn't have to do that and have those conversations all the time. So some of those simple things, I think, that we put on our website have made people more likely to apply, I think.
Thanks, Patrick. It's really interesting and great session.
And if anybody's got questions and I haven't had a chance to ask them, I'm quite happy for people to email me as well.
Perfect, and I can share your email and contact details after the session. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. huge thanks to Patrick, a fantastic session. I'm sure you've left us all thinking with more questions that people will come back to you and ask. We are looking for speakers for next month. Anybody that wants to take the spotlight next month, let's get the momentum going. Perhaps you can't do next month, but the month after. So we will still be knocking on doors just to hear everybody's stories. So conscious of time, we're just gone over. Thank you again, Patrick, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Patrick, do you want to hang on 2 seconds?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Julie, apparently we can't, I don't think our business update can go ahead because it must be on the same profile for the Zoom call.
Oh dear. Right. Okay. We'll need to come off then.
Oh, okay.
Patrick, can I drop you? Can we have a chat this afternoon, maybe?
Yeah, no, I'm going to be
Okay.
interviewing kind of in there, but any time after 5 would be good.
Okay, fab. All right. Thanks so much for your time today, Patrick.
Okay, I'd be interested in any feedback that people had. You can always do things better, can't you?
It's really
Absolutely.
good, really good, Patrick. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All
Cheers.
right. Thanks, Patrick. Bye-bye.
Bye, Patrick. Bye.